What happens when a character is released that eclipses everything else? What happens when that character becomes the status quo? What happens when everything afterwards has to compete with them? This is the Acheronification of Honkai Star Rail. But before we talk about Acheron, I need to give you a bit of a history lesson on some of the characters leading up to her release. At the launch of the game, we got Seele and Jing Yuan. Seele was incredibly strong at the time, but there was a Nothing Burger controversy saying Jing Yuan is mid, which he was. In 1.1 we got Silverwolf. Now what Silverwolf does is she implants a random weakness of a teammate onto one target. If you were a Star Rail player back in the day, you would remember everyone calling her broken, a must pull, and my favorite one, future proof. Now looking back, I can't blame anybody for believing that she was future proof, as she was the first character that really broke the rules of the game. However, she was still pretty balanced around the fact that she was locked to single target, which is a large part of why she became a lot weaker over time. After her we had Blade, the first HP scaling DPS who had the upside of being very tanky and healing himself. We had Kafka, a lightning nihility character who isn't exactly a DPS, but enabled the damage over time or DOT archetype, giving characters like Sampo a chance to shine. But after that, things started to ramp up. In 1.3 we had the release of Dan Heng and Bibber Lune, easily surpassing the previous DPSs at the cost of all of your skill points. And one patch later, My Glorious Queen Jing Liu released, matching Dill's damage for a lot less skill points and opting for self buffs instead. But the thing was, they were still very similar to each other when it comes to damage. Around this time, the concern of power creep started to be tossed around more and more. Some believe that this is where it started, and I'm inclined to agree. They were quite a bit stronger than what we had before, and it was a cause for some discussion. But these worries were minor, as HSR did not seem to be going into the direction of rampant power scaling yet. In the following patches, they seemed to keep up the Destruction duo as the top dogs. The patch afterwards, we got Argenti. In 1.6 we got the release of Dr. Ratio, a completely free unit who is very strong and broke the impression that the free characters are going to be weak. Going into Penacony, the game was doing great. I still stick by to this day that 2.0 was the best time to play the game when it came to the meta. Jing Liu, Dill, DOT, hell even Blade and Seele were still being played to good effect. With the first anniversary coming around, obviously Hoyoverse wanted to make it big. So who did they decide to release? None other than Acheron. Now she is a version of a character called Raiden Mei from Honkai Impact 3rd. I know she is a very important character in that game, which I refuse to play. Anyways, in Honkai Star Rail, she is the Emanator of Nihility, which in simple terms means that she is very strong in lore, and her gameplay reflected that. I remember watching videos on her when she first came out and thinking, man, this character is broken as shit. She did not utilize energy, but instead she got sacks from her ultimate using debuffs, and her ultimate was a very powerful nuke. We mentioned before how characters like Silverwolf were able to bypass the elemental system with her skill. Acheron was able to just flat out ignore weakness types on her ultimate. Why does she do that? I don't know. And when she released, she was easily the best DPS in the game, and it wasn't even close. She was considered an anomaly for her time, being at the top of every tier list. Now, there's nothing wrong with releasing a broken character, but when we talk about power balance, we need to take into consideration two things. 1. How fast is it? Is it just a few really strong characters a year? Or is it just one character who is strictly the best, where the rest of the characters are weaker? Or is it where characters get stronger every patch, either marginally or rapidly? And 2. How prevalent is it? Meaning, is the difference between characters significant to the point where older members of the roster are a lot weaker or at some times unusable? Or is it small, where there are clearly better options but your older characters will be just fine given you have good investment or strategy? When you look at it like that, it becomes a bit more complicated to really pinpoint a state of power imbalance in these games. HSR did not have a significant balancing issue until around the first year mark. I thought Acheron was a problem ever since she was released. The light cone being pretty much required was not fun, and I was worried her damage would become a problem for the game balance. But I was willing to let it slide under the impression that her strength was a one-off occasion. You know, how bad could it possibly be? Well boy, I was wrong. Do you want to know what the next character to come out to rival Acheron was? Firefly, a character who utilized the new super break mechanic, which allowed her to do a ton of damage with very little investment. And this told me that Acheron was not the new damage ceiling, but was now the new damage floor, and that this trend would continue into the far future. This is what I've called the Acheronification, where she becomes the status quo, meaning everything afterwards must compete with her and ideally surpass her. When you have characters who are just so high above the rest and dunk on everything else, players who own said characters just got a free win button. With that, Hoyo was required to make the endgame harder. So how do they do it? Herein comes a little thing we call HP inflation. HP inflation is where the enemy HP is raised rapidly without doing anything else that makes a fight engaging or interesting to play. We see this a lot when the older bosses return to the endgame modes, where the lack of unique mechanics result in you just beating up a punching bag. Now, I don't want to talk too much about HP inflation because I want to save that for a separate video, but it's been massively impacting the endgame, especially recently. And given how strong the characters are getting, I don't see this slowing down anytime soon. It's a very vicious cycle. New characters come out with very overloaded kits, stronger than the rest, Hoyo deems the endgame needs to get harder, HP goes up, rinse and repeat. And the funny thing is, even after the HP rises, the new characters will rarely care. They will just destroy the content regardless of buff, environment, or anything else because they are just that broken. The example I point to when I say this is the MOC in 2.7. This MOC included Svarog and the True Sting. This was a more AoE focused MOC, so characters who hit multiple targets were preferred. The floor buff also spawned 2 Trotters, which, when defeated, did a decent chunk of damage to all elite or higher enemies. Now, credit where credit is due, I thought this was a great buff and helped some characters use the extra damage as a crutch. Fei Xiao, a single target damage dealer, was performing similarly to DOT, the AoE team. It's kind of crazy how a character who is built for single target is as strong in AoE as an AoE team. And I even ran into a similar situation recently. Now, if you don't know, I am a very big fan of Jing Liu. Jing Liu is a character typically used as a gotcha moment to show power creep, understandably so. I have been every MOC with her for many patches now. In the recent MOC in 3.1, we had the new boss Flame Reaver. The MOC Blessing allowed Jing Liu to play Sustainless without worrying about dying. Using my incredibly large brain, a 160 speed win set, and hundreds of dollars into Eidolons, I was able to squeeze out a 2-cycle run. Now, I know that sounds like a humble brag, but just listen to what I'm saying. I was happy about this, but I couldn't help but feel a little bit disappointed that I needed the right blessing, the right weakness, the right supports, and the right investment into relics, all to have her not feel weak. When I finished that run, I sat back and thought, wow, I did all of that just for her to still be outclassed by a Naxa? And that's the thing about the current character balance. For all the effort you need to make old units feel good, it's hard to blame people for giving up on characters when the new ones are just much stronger than what we had in the past. And that isn't me saying that you shouldn't need to put effort into your characters, in fact I think quite the opposite. But when you need to jump through hoops to make them work, when a new character can walk up with the team with much slower investment and blow your old DPSs out of the water with ease, then it feels like I just wasted my time, my money, and my energy. And that's why people complain so much about the power creep, even if they can easily clear, because they don't like having their old investments feel worthless, especially when most of the time you're better off just getting the new character instead of getting Eidolons for your old ones. Like for example, will you pull an E2 of an earlier DPS or an E0 of a new DPS? And that's the thing, it's simply not worth it. And I know people will say, well, power creep doesn't matter because you can still clear all the content, and I really don't agree with that sentiment, and here's why. You might be able to clear now, but we need to think about the state of the endgame in general. It will continuously get more challenging, and if your team isn't getting any stronger, then you are going to struggle. Sure, you can clear in 7, 8, 9 cycles right now, but that doesn't give me confidence that I'm going to clear in the future. Going for Eidolons on characters can slow that down, but how long until it just turns into a game of you dragging your old units across the finish line using the new broken supports? That's not a fun nor engaging gameplay experience. So why did the damage ceiling get so high in the first place? Honkai Star Rail is a very simple game. You only have 3 buttons and extremely limited options of what you can do every turn. There's only so many variations of characters you can do with similar things with similar damage before you start running into stagnation, as well as a very real possibility that people might not feel incentivizable for new units because they can just run their old ones. So in that situation, you kind of have to make the unit stronger and give some sort of incentive for people who want to roll for them. This is typically not an issue in an action game with real-time combat, because you can make up for the lack of damage on your older units by playing better. But in a turn-based game with very little flexibility like HSR, you really can't make up the damage difference because at the end of the day, it's just a numbers check. And that's such a shame because the combat started off so strong. Back in the day, you actually needed to think about what you're doing. You wanted to bring certain characters that match the element, so you can break the enemy and do more damage. Now it's, everyone is now weak to my element, maybe all of them, or I just ignore that toughness bar altogether, and then I beat the game. It feels like they want to water down their already very basic combat system. That is the most likely reason, but there is another possible reason. They want to cater to the new player experience. The new player experience is something vital to any game, and while the ever-rising damage ceiling is very frustrating for veterans, it is very good for new players. They can just pull the new characters and bulldoze everything. And we have seen in the past that Hoyost has tailored to that newer player experience by giving you things like Harmony Trailblazer after you beat Cocolia, which makes sense because you literally could not play Firefly without them. They've also nerfed story bosses like Aventurine, but maybe that's because people just cannot play the game. We don't have actual analytics on who's doing what, so I'm not going to sit here and say, only insert small percentage here of players do endgame, but I wouldn't be surprised if Hoyo wanted to cater to those people that might not be as experienced with the game. And it's also a matter of the supports in the game. Honkai Star Rail might as well be called Honkai Support Rail because they are all very broken. Except you. When we make a new support character, they will end up buffing older units. Like for example, Jing Yuan actually became usable after Sunday, and Blade has been getting a lot better with characters like Tribby and Hyacine. But on the other hand, they will also inevitably buff the new characters, and then we create a sort of rich get richer situation, where the new DPS support combo are raising the damage ceiling, and instead of one character power creeping, it's actually two. And in the very likely chance that two characters share the exact same team, you are pretty much always going to pick the stronger one. If there's anything we can take away from Honkai Star Rail, is that they constantly like to break the rules of the game. Things like weakness break can be overcome by characters who implant weaknesses or just ignore the toughness bar altogether. Skill points are largely not an issue anymore with characters like an S1 Sunday who gives a ton of SP. It feels like now, everyone just does everything. Characters like Hyacine are doing so much damage for a fucking sustain. Having diversity in your roster is nice, but when it comes to the cost of your base game mechanics, then is it really the best idea? I mean, rules are made to be broken, I guess. And I've noticed that this issue with the ever-increasing damage ceiling has even caused player reception in the community to change. It used to be, oh man, this character's so cool and does a lot of damage, to, this character's gonna get power crept in 2 patches, so who cares? It has led to a lot more paranoia. Now we all know about FOMO, or fear of missing out, but a term that we should be using more to describe this game is FOBO, fear of a better option, and that describes this pretty well. Do you remember all the people saying to skip a Goliath because Castrus was going to power creep her? Looking back, this was pretty stupid, but can I blame people for thinking this? Not necessarily, no. Honkai Star Rail has conditioned their player base to be so paranoid about the next best thing that they will not pull new characters out of fear of it. And don't even get me started on pulling DPSs on reruns. That's something most of the player base doesn't even do anymore because they know they're already halfway out the door. It's at the point where if you're not constantly aiming for the top, then you aren't worth it. You won't stand with the likes of Kenneth Castellana and Miss Global Passive. The problem now is that characters just feel disposable, and this is upsetting for anyone who is a fan of that character. After all, the point of a gacha game is to farm parasocialism and have you be attached to those characters. But when you can't use those characters, it feels bad. People will enjoy the game more when they're playing the characters that they like. I've probably used this example a few times throughout my videos, but I did not like Zenless Zone Zero much until I got Jun, and I enjoyed the game a lot more after playing her. But when it's at the point where you can barely use your old characters without all of the stars aligning, it's very frustrating. And this also means that Hoyoverse doesn't have to try very hard either, because they know that characters, regardless of their story, animations, design, or anything else, will sell as long as they're broken. And we've seen examples of characters who are not very story relevant, but they are very broken, so people will still roll for them. So how do we fix this? Well, it's hard. You might think the most obvious answer is to simply make characters more balanced, and that is a good argument. It seems like a flawless argument, but it does have a major issue. While having a more balanced character does help slow down power creep in the short term, when another character inevitably comes out that is broken, then the former is going to feel a lot worse a lot faster. If that situation does not happen, it can lead to times where people won't feel as incentivized to pull for new characters in the game that prioritizes meta strength over nearly everything else. The problem is Hoyoverse set a standard that characters will constantly be getting stronger and stronger over time. So now that's what's used to judge any new characters, meaning if you try to move backwards and make something weaker, then people aren't going to like it. I've seen some argue that because the new DPSs are closer in damage to each other, therefore the game is balanced, which I really don't agree with, since that definition of balanced means everyone is instantly T0 and the older units are still garbage. The second option is something that Honkai Star Rail did announce recently, character buffs. This is a great thing, but what I'm concerned about is it going to be enough? Even if Blade does get buffed, will you run him over Maide? Even if Jing Liu gets buffed, will she be worth running over the Herda? Probably not, no. The problem is you are trying to buff the character to the status quo of power. Unless the damage ceiling stops rising, then we're going to end up in a situation where these characters need to be repeatedly buffed due to the ever-increasing rise in the future of overloaded kits, as well as Hoyoverse's idea of difficulty. If this were the case, then character buffs need to be way more frequent, as spending nearly 6 months to buff 4 characters is a joke. If this were to be true, then we could actually have a game that isn't dominated by whoever is running on banner, and actually give you some variety to what you play. But what I believe to be the best solution to help all this go away is to add a strict damage ceiling. Nobody will surpass this damage ceiling. If they want to make the ceiling higher, then every character will be buffed accordingly. This doesn't mean that every character needs to be exactly the same level, but when it's at the point where old units can barely even clear the content, then that's where we have a problem. This would also encourage them to find more routes to make the characters more marketable, without simply inflating their multipliers and stats. They would have to try more with the story to try to sell you on the unit. They could maybe add more skins to the game. I know I personally would rather them monetize cosmetics instead of monetizing power creep. And it would also require them to explore more types of content and gameplay instead of just mindlessly beefing up HP. If we had a damage ceiling implemented at, say, Acheron's release, then we would not be having this conversation. Realistically, Hoyo knows what they're doing. You can't make all these characters and not realize that they're getting so absurdly overpowered and raising the damage ceiling so high that your old roster can barely compete. Hoyoverse themselves have admitted that old characters are not viable in endgame content. They shouldn't have waited this long to buff characters, and even at this rate, the massive power gap will not be fixed anytime soon. This stuff does sell, so they will keep doing it, which is pretty unfortunate since the older units will fall to obscurity and stay that way without interference from the devs. Like I've said before, power creep is inevitable in every gacha game, but what's important is the way that it's handled. The absurd damage inflation that started with Acheron has made Honkai Star Rail a game now known for its power creep. I wanted to end this video off on a higher note, but I realistically don't see anything I talked about today changing. The damage ceiling will keep increasing, the HP will continue to rise, and Dawei will keep accumulating more yachts. But over time, Honkai Star Rail is going to bleed players over this, and while the profit gain is working in the short term, I really can't see people sticking around for the long term. We do have 3.4 coming up, with multiple new characters as well as the 4 buffed characters, so all we can do is hope that Hoyoverse reconsiders the way their characters are designed. Honkai Star Rail seriously has all the potential in the world to improve, but the character balancing in this game needs to be fixed. Desperately. And thank you so much for reaching the end of this video. This is something I've wanted to talk about for a very long time, so I'm glad I was finally able to cover it. If you enjoyed, I'd appreciate you liking and subscribing because we are on our way to 10,000 subscribers and it really does help me out a lot. If you want a place to come and chat, then consider joining the Discord down below. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.